All right, we are back for the second half of our section on deterrence, and here we're going to talk a little bit about kind of testing deterrence and some other kind of factors and offshoots of the idea of deterrence. Okay, so the general kind of idea and the general state of research when it comes to deterrence is that there's been tons of research on different factors or different ideas of how deterrence is supposed to work and whether it can, people can actually be deterred from committing crime, right? And researchers have specifically looked at the certainty of punishment, the swiftness of punishment, and the severity of punishment, right? And with the certainty of punishment, this is where we get maybe some evidence that people can be deterred in some ways sometimes. So for rational choice theorists, for deterrence theorists, this is kind of the best chance they have of showing that deterrence can actually be effective, and that is in manipulating the certainty of punishment. There's been almost no research on the swiftness of punishment. Right? There's really no documentable evidence one way or the other about whether the swiftness of punishment works or not, because it's so difficult to manipulate. It's so difficult for us to have any kind of variation in how fast somebody is punished or not that it's really hard to research. So there's no real evidence that the swiftness of punishment works, right? And then the severity of punishment, there's basically no evidence at all that increasing or decreasing the severity of punishment changes the amount of crime at all, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about specific examples of each of these. But there's really not a lot out there showing that manipulating any of the three of these will actually reduce crime, right? One important factor that we need to think about is it the certainty, the swiftness, and the severity of punishment that deters people, or is it the perception of the certainty and the swiftness and the severity of punishment that deters people? Because it doesn't matter what the actual certainty of punishment is. All that matters is the perceived certainty of punishment when people are making this choice, right? So some researchers have, instead of looking at the actual certainty of punishment, have looked at the perceived certainty of punishment. And we're going to talk about that, right? But the other thing that kind of might provide some evidence for deterrence theory is that the vast majority of all the people out there who get arrested for committing a crime are never arrested again. The vast majority of criminals are one-timers. Okay? It is a very small percentage of criminals that get arrested 2, 3, 4, 5, a dozen times. Those are a very small subset of all the people who get arrested for committing crime. Okay? So that, on the kind of surface of it, does provide at least some evidence that there are a large number of people out there who commit a crime, get caught, get punished, and then say, oh, well, I'm never doing that again. And then continue to be law-abiding citizens, right? Now, one test of deterrence is with the death penalty. Okay? The death penalty is becoming less and less popular over time. But for a long time, especially at least in the United States, in the late 20th century, the death penalty was seen as kind of the ultimate severity of punishment. Whether Beccaria agreed with that idea or not, it was seen as the ultimate deterrence. Right? You can't get more severe than the death penalty. And what every study, every major analysis of the death penalty has really shown in the field of criminology is that it doesn't deter crime. The death penalty, there's been study after study after study showing that whether a state has the death penalty or not, or before a state has a death penalty versus after they have the death penalty, or while they have it versus after they've gotten rid of it, there is no measurable difference in the amount of murder that takes place. So this is another big strike against deterrence, in that the most severe punishment seems to have no deterrent effect on the amount of murder that happens, right? Now, another way to research deterrence is with scenario studies, right? This is where you kind of sit a bunch of people down and you give them kind of a written description of a scenario. And then you ask them a question at the end, right? So in other words, if you're faced with this situation and here's all the different factors involved in the situation, would you do this thing or not, right? So would you steal a candy bar? If you were, you're in a store, there's one person working and they're helping another customer, and you're very hungry, you don't have any money on you, there's no security cameras, would you steal this candy bar? And then the next person might get one that says the same situation, but there are security cameras. And then the next person might get one where there is security cameras and another clerk, or there's a police officer shopping in the store, right? So there's kind of a basic idea, and then a bunch of different people get slightly different versions of that scenario. In some cases, there's no police officer present. Some cases there is. In some cases, there's no security cameras. In others, there is. In some cases, the possible punishment for doing the thing is a year in prison. In other cases, it's a fine. And so we can slightly manipulate these different factors of the scenario and see how often people will say, yes, I would do it, or no, I wouldn't do it, based on which particular factors are there and which aren't, right? And if you get a whole bunch of people to answer these questions, you can get a good idea of what factors make people more likely or less likely to at least claim they would do this thing or not do this thing, right? And what this scenario research has found is that of the three factors for deterrence theory, certainty, swiftness, and severity, the only one that seems to affect whether people claim they would do the thing or not do the thing is the certainty of punishment. As the certainty of punishment increases, the odds of people saying they would do that thing seems to decrease. Question is how much and how often, and does increasing the certainty of punishment reduce crime a lot, or does it reduce it a little? And are people being accurate when they say yes, they would do it, or no, they wouldn't? When they're faced with a real life scenario, with that same situation in real life, would they actually do that or not do it the way they said they would, right? So there are some issues here, but certainty seems to be the only one, based on this research, that could even possibly maybe influence whether somebody chooses to commit that crime or not. But interestingly, when looking at the punishments themselves, it wasn't the legal punishments that seemed to affect people's decisions of whether to do the thing or not. It wasn't the possibility of fines or getting arrested or spending time in prison that seems to be able to cause people to say, no, I don't want to do that. It was the idea of the informal sanction. It was the idea of their parents finding out they had done that thing. It was the idea of their kids knowing that their parent had committed this crime. It was the idea of being shamed and losing their job and being seen as a criminal by their friends and family. That seemed to be the type of punishment that they feared. Not being arrested and going in front of a judge and getting sentenced to prison or a fine or whatever. But the informal, the people around them knowing they had done the thing seemed to be the type of punishment that was most influential in causing people to choose whether they would do the thing or not do the thing. Now, one of the factors involved with this is, as we talked about earlier, the perception of crime, of punishment, rather than the actual possibility of punishment. It's not actual punishments that are effective. It's the perception of punishment, right? So if I choose to commit this crime, there's a difference between the actual odds of me being punished for it and my perceived odds of being punished for it. And if those two are wildly different, that can cause me to commit a crime when I otherwise wouldn't, or not commit a crime when I otherwise would, right? So one of the things that research has shown is this thing called the experiential effect, which is that whether we commit crime or not influences our perception of the odds of getting caught much more than how we perceive the odds of getting caught or not influences whether we commit crime or not. This is a really kind of different than what a lot of people would have assumed, right? So it's not whether we perceive the odds of getting caught as high or low that determines whether we're going to commit crime. It's whether we have committed crimes or not that influences how we perceive the odds of getting caught. And for a lot of crimes, especially the upper class crimes like drunk driving, it's the more people have committed those crimes, the lower they think the odds of their being punished are. So people who have never driven drunk think the odds of getting caught for drunk driving are much higher, and people who have drive drunk many times perceive the odds of getting caught as much lower, right? And there's lots of different reasons for this, but it's probably the fact that people who are doing these things know that I've gotten away with it 20 times and didn't get caught doing it and punished for doing it until the 21st, so my odds of getting caught are clearly very low. Whereas people who have never done it just kind of assume that if they did do it, they would get caught, so they perceive the odds there of being much higher, right? Now, one of the things that might be able to influence deterrence, and we're going to talk about this in a later section, is what's called stakes in conformity. In other words, what do you have to lose? If we're going to be deterred, if we're going to say, oh, well, the possible negatives are outweighed by the possible positives, or the other way around, a lot of that is based on what do you have to lose. So if I'm homeless with no family, no real friends, and I'm desperate for drug money, I don't really have a lot to lose by going out and burglarizing somebody's house. But if I have friends and family who love me, and a good job, and a house, and a nice apartment, or pets, that's going to weigh into my rational choice of whether I want to commit this crime or not, right? So one way we can influence kind of the severity of punishment in an indirect way, and knowing that the informal sanctions are more important to people than the formal sanctions, is to look at stakes in conformity and try to give people more to lose by committing crimes. Because the more people have to lose, the less they will commit crimes. So if we can give people, if we can make sure that people have jobs and houses and family and things around them, they have more to lose, more stakes in conformity, and thus they will be less likely to go out and commit crimes, according to this deterrence theory, right? Now, there's a couple of different programs for youth specifically that are designed to kind of deter youth from committing more juvenile crime and then, of course, becoming adult offenders after they grow up, right? Two of the famous ones, or famous types of ones, are the Scared Straight program, and then there's boot camps. With the Scared Straight program, this is a program that started, I think, in the 70s, where they would take at-risk juvenile youth and take them into adult prisons and have the adult prisoners kind of scare the kids and talk to them about how horrible prison is, and show them what life as an adult prisoner is like, and how much they're living in these prisons is terrible, and all these things, in order to kind of scare those juveniles into becoming more law-abiding, in order to deter them from committing crime, in order to make their perceptions of punishment, of the severity of punishment at least, increase, right? And what they found is Doesn't work. In fact, there's some studies that show that juveniles who participate in scared straight programs are actually more likely to commit juvenile and adult offenses than not. Then there are boot camps, right? And with boot camps, the idea there is to put juvenile offenders into a military-style punishment situation where they're, there's rankings, and there you wake up early in the morning and go jogging and train all day and wear a uniform and salute and yes sir and no sir and do all those things just like a the actual military boot camp program. And the idea there is to kind of instill discipline and kind of get juveniles to understand the punishment for their actions and understand that, all this situation, this experience is really, really not fun. There's way too much discipline and not a lot of freedom, and I don't get to do the things I want to do, and I've got to march and jog and wear this uniform, and it's an attempt to instill discipline and change choice-making processes and deter youth. And it really doesn't work either. There's some evidence showing it works, but there's a problem where the juvenile offenders assigned to boot camp programs were different than the juveniles assigned to other programs in the first place. So is the result really indicative of success of the program, or is it indicative of the fact that that group was different than the group that didn't go to the boot camp in the first place? And these programs just don't seem to work. But the biggest finding of all this deterrence research is that the assumption of free will in the criminal decision doesn't seem to be present. People don't seem to be making rational choices, at least when it comes to crime. We can argue about all the other choices that people make in their lives, but at least when it comes to crime, there doesn't seem to be a lot of rational choices being made. This assumption of free will doesn't seem to apply. Whether somebody becomes a criminal or not seems much more externally focused than just, do people choose to commit crime or not? Do people weigh the punishments versus the benefits? Do people, people don't seem to be thinking about this, again, either consciously or subconsciously. It seems to be some other factor than people's decisions that causes them to become a criminal or not. Now, we're going to talk about a slightly different theory that is kind of sort of related to deterrence theory. Some criminology courses and criminology textbooks lump it in with deterrence. Some put it off on its own thing. But I chose to put it here with deterrence. Even though it's not quite the proper place for it, there is no really good or better other place for it. So we're going to talk about it now. And that is routine activities theory. Okay? Which came about in the late 70s. It was first kind of written down by these two guys named Felsen and Cohen. And I actually got the chance to meet and study under Professor Felsen, who's a wonderful, wonderful man. Super fun and interesting and brilliant. But he and Cohen came up with this idea in the late 70s. And it's not necessarily a theory of crime. It's more a theory of victimization. It doesn't necessarily predict who will become a criminal and why. It's more about why certain people or things or areas become victims or locations of crime. But what routine activities theory basically boils down to, and this is a much more kind of brief description of this idea, there's a lot more to it than this. But the kind of 2-minute version here is that in order for a crime to happen, there are 3 things that need to come together. That is a motivated offender, a suitable target, and a lack of guardianship. When those 3 things combine in time and space, a crime happens. And how often those 3 things come together in time and space is affected by our routine activities, right? So the more we put ourselves in places where there are motivated offenders and a lack of guardianship, the more we are going to be suitable targets, and thus more crimes are going to happen with us as the suitable targets, right? So there is a lot of research that's been done on this, and part of that has shown that there are indeed these kind of hot spots for crime. Kind of as this theory might predict, crimes don't seem to happen randomly geographically. They happen in places where there are more potential offenders, where there are more suitable targets, where there are more, less guardianship, right? So any given city, if you look at the number of, assaults, those aren't going to be distributed randomly. Those are going to be concentrated in areas like, the downtown bar areas, where people kind of gather on Friday and Saturday nights and consume alcohol, which is kind of as predicted in this theory, right? It's also been applied to cybercrime. And what it shows is that, the more people kind of spend time on the internet, the more likely they are to be the victim of a cybercrime. They're also more likely to be offenders in cybercrime, the more they spend time in their routine activities on the internet. The more they become suitable targets, the more they become victims of crime, right? And lack of guardianship can apply here to, in a cybercrime context, can be, antivirus software and phishing prevention education programs and all those things. And all of that kind of seems to be applicable, at least in some way, with both cybercrime and traditional crime. There's been lots of research about this kind of routine activities theory. Now, one of the kind of policy implications here of routine activities theory has been come to be called, it's informally known as target hardening, right? But the more formal term is crime prevention through environmental design. In other words, if we can kind of separate out the motivated offenders, the suitable targets, and the lack of guardianship in time and space through designing the spaces where people are, the less crime we're going to have. So this means things like more street lighting, more security cameras, more alarm systems, more kind of responsible people, overseers in different places to try to prevent the opportunity for crime to happen, right? So that's the end of our discussion about deterrence theory. Again, there's a lot more to this. This is kind of the brief overview of these different kind of, the Beccaria style deterrence, modern rational choice theory, routine activities theory. There's tons and tons more out there about this. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to those topics. But that's all the time I have. Thank you so much for watching.